My name is Samantha Wilson, 34 years old, and I never planned to become a corporate whistleblower. 8 years at Westfield Capital, a Harvard Business School degree, and a reputation for ethical analysis could not prepare me for what happened when I discovered fatal flaws in our new investment strategy. All I did was my job, but apparently that was too much for Ethan Harrison, our CEO's son, who publicly humiliated me for it. Before I tell you how I brought down the golden boy who nearly destroyed our company, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe if you value integrity in business as much as I do. Westfield Capital was not just any financial management firm. With over $30 billion in assets under management and a client list that included Fortune 100 companies and several foreign governments, we had built our reputation on conservative, well-researched investment strategies and exceptional risk management. This was precisely why I had fought so hard to work there after graduating from Harvard Business School with honors. I still remember my first day walking through the gleaming glass doors of our Midtown Manhattan office, my navy blue suit, perfectly pressed portfolio tucked under my arm. I was terrified but determined to prove myself. Back then, Westfield operated as a true meritocracy. Your ideas and your work ethic mattered more than your connections or your last name. At least that was how it started. Over the next 6 years, I climbed from junior analyst to senior risk manager, building a reputation for identifying potential problems before they materialized. 3 times my assessments prevented the company from making catastrophic investments, saving millions of dollars. By my 7th year, I had a corner office with a view of Central Park and a team of 5 analysts reporting to me. Richard Harrison, our CEO and founder, had taken a personal interest in my career. A tall, silver-haired man with penetrating blue eyes and a commanding presence, Richard had built Westfield from nothing 30 years ago. He valued data-driven decisions and rigorous analysis. In my early years, he would occasionally stop by my desk to discuss my latest risk assessment. The difference between success and failure in this business, he once told me, is paying attention to details others ignore. I took those words to heart. Then everything changed when Ethan Harrison joined the company. Fresh from his MBA at Wharton, Ethan was immediately appointed Executive Vice President of Strategy. No gradual promotion, no proving ground. Just immediate authority because his last name matched the one on the building. Ethan was 30 years old, 5'11", with his father's blue eyes, but none of his gravitas. Where Richard was thoughtful and measured, Ethan was impulsive and brash. He wore bespoke suits that seemed to emphasize his athletic build, drove an imported sports car, and had a habit of interrupting people mid-sentence. Yet despite these qualities, he had a certain charisma that drew people to him, particularly those looking to advance their careers. My closest ally at Westfield was Diane Miller, a brilliant analyst who had joined the risk management team around the same time I did. With her curly auburn hair and perpetual cup of coffee, Diane was both sharp-witted and unfailingly honest. When Ethan first arrived, she leaned over during the welcome reception and whispered, $10, says Daddy's boy causes a disaster within a year. I shushed her, but privately I shared her concerns. Harold Jenkins had been my mentor since I joined Westfield. As the former director of risk management before his semi-retirement to a consultant role, Harold had taught me everything I knew about identifying hidden dangers in seemingly attractive investments. In his 70s, with a slight stoop and half-moon glasses, Harold represented the old guard of Westfield, cautious and principled. The executive team included Victor Caldwell, our CFO, a numbers man who quickly allied himself with Ethan. Victor had always struck me as someone who followed power rather than principles, and Ethan's arrival gave him a new patron to court. With his slicked back hair and permanent calculating expression, Victor became Ethan's strongest supporter in the executive suite. Not everyone fell in line so easily. Eleanor Winston, one of our longest-serving board members, maintained a healthy skepticism toward Ethan. A formidable woman in her 60s who had broken numerous glass ceilings in her banking career, Eleanor had known Richard for decades and was one of the few people who could speak frankly with him. She had always been kind to me, recognizing my potential early on. There was also Lawrence Blackwell, representing our lead investor group, Meridian Partners. Lawrence was known for asking the toughest questions at shareholder meetings and demanded complete transparency. With his reputation for financial forensics, executives dreaded his inquiries, which could pierce through even the most carefully constructed presentations. The culture shift began almost immediately after Ethan arrived. Weekly risk assessment meetings were shortened or canceled. Long-standing approval processes were streamlined or eliminated entirely. Ethan called it removing bureaucratic roadblocks, but to those of us in risk management, it felt like dismantling safety protocols. At first, I tried to adapt. I condensed my reports, focused on the most critical issues, and attempted to present concerns in the positive, solution-oriented manner Ethan preferred. I wanted to believe that perhaps some of our processes were overly cautious and could benefit from modernization. After all, Westfield had maintained an extremely conservative approach for decades. Then came the company-wide meeting, where Ethan unveiled his vision for the future. Standing confidently on the stage of our largest conference room, sleeves rolled up and voice full of conviction, he announced a revolutionary new investment strategy that would catapult Westfield into the 21st century. The strategy involved heavy investments in emerging markets, particularly in high-risk, high-reward sectors that Westfield had traditionally avoided. "The days of plotting safe returns are over," Ethan declared, as charts showing projected growth curves far steeper than anything in our company's history filled the screen behind him. "We are going to double our returns within 18 months while maintaining our commitment to client security." As applause filled the room, I exchanged a glance with Diane. The numbers did not add up. You could not double returns without significantly increasing risk. It was a fundamental principle of finance. But Ethan's presentation skipped over risk assessment, entirely focusing instead on the potential rewards. And as I looked around at my colleagues' excited faces, I realized I might be the only one prepared to question the golden vision Ethan was selling. The morning after Ethan's presentation, I arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m., 2 hours before most of my colleagues would appear. I needed quiet time to analyze the investment strategy documents that had been distributed after the meeting. With a large cup of black coffee and my favorite analysis software open, I began a methodical examination of the proposal. The strategy was ambitious, focusing on rapid expansion into emerging markets across Southeast Asia and parts of Africa. It called for significant investments in local startups, with minimal track records but high growth potential. The projected returns were impressive, assuming everything went according to plan. But as any experienced risk manager knows, things rarely go according to plan. By 9 a.m., I had identified my first major concern: currency fluctuation risk. The strategy assumed stable exchange rates over the next 18 months, an assumption that contradicted historical data for the regions in question. I pulled up 5 years of exchange rate data and overlaid it with the strategy projections. The mismatch was glaring. My second concern emerged around 10:30 a.m., political instability. 3 of the 5 primary target countries had experienced major governmental changes in the past 2 years. One was currently dealing with election disputes. The strategy made no provisions for political risk insurance or contingency plans for rapid withdrawal if conditions deteriorated. By lunchtime, I had compiled a list of 6 major risk factors that had been either minimized or completely overlooked in Ethan's proposal. Each one individually posed a significant threat to the projected returns. Together, they created a potential perfect storm that could devastate not just the new investments but potentially the firm's overall stability. I needed a second opinion. I called Harold Jenkins, asking if he could review my findings. Harold agreed to meet me for coffee that afternoon. At the small cafe 2 blocks from the office, I spread my annotated documents across the table, while Harold examined them carefully through his reading glasses. "This is concerning, Samantha," he said, finally removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Your analysis is sound. These risk factors are significant and appear to have been deliberately downplayed." "Deliberately?" I asked, surprised by his certainty. "Look at Appendix C." Harold pointed to a small footnote on page 47 of the document. They acknowledge the currency risk, but bury the mitigation strategy in technical jargon that most readers would skip. And the mitigation itself is grossly inadequate. I spent the next 3 days gathering more evidence. I ran stress tests on the investment model, simulating various adverse scenarios based on historical precedents. I researched similar strategies attempted by other firms and their outcomes. I compiled case studies of previous failures in the same markets. The picture grew increasingly alarming. Diane joined my impromptu research team, staying late to help analyze market correlation data. "This strategy assumes these 5 markets will move independently," she noted, highlighting a section of the report. "But the historical data shows a 92% correlation during downturns. If one falls, they all fall." "Exactly," I agreed. "And look at this liquidity assumption. It presumes we could exit these positions within 3 days if necessary, but the average exit time for similar positions during the last downturn was 21 days. By the end of the week, we had compiled a comprehensive risk assessment that identified 12 critical flaws in the strategy. The conclusion was unavoidable. The strategy as proposed had less than a 15% chance of achieving its stated returns and a greater than 60% chance of resulting in significant losses. I faced an internal conflict. Presenting these findings would put me in direct opposition to Ethan Harrison, the CEO's son and rising star. It could potentially damage my career at Westfield, the company I had worked so hard to join and where I had built my reputation. But failing to present them would violate my professional ethics and potentially allow the company to walk into a disaster. Diane recognized my struggle. Over late-night takeout in my office, she voiced what I had been thinking. "You know this could backfire. Right, Ethan has been consolidating his influence for months. People who challenge him tend to find themselves sidelined." I pushed my half-eaten container of pad thai aside. "I know, but what choice do I have? This is literally my job. If I see a serious risk and say nothing, what am I even doing here?" "Just be careful," Diane warned. "Make it about the data, not about Ethan. And maybe talk to Richard privately first." I considered her advice, but ultimately decided a formal presentation was necessary. This needed to be on the record. I prepared a comprehensive 30-page risk assessment document with executive summary, detailed analysis, historical comparisons, and recommended modifications that could salvage parts of the strategy while mitigating the most serious risks. On Friday afternoon, I sent an email to the executive team requesting a meeting to discuss risk concerns related to the new investment strategy. Within minutes, I received a calendar invitation for Monday morning. The subject line read, "Strategic Initiative Risk Review." All the executive officers were included along with Ethan Harrison. The meeting would take place in the main boardroom. As I packed up for the weekend, I felt a mix of apprehension and determination. I was doing my job, fulfilling my responsibility to the company. Yet I could not shake the feeling that I was walking into a confrontation that could change the course of my career at Westfield. Still, some principles were worth standing up for, and the integrity of our risk management process was one of them. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and light rain matching my apprehensive mood. I had spent the weekend refining my presentation, anticipating potential objections, and rehearsing my key points. I arrived an hour early to set up in the boardroom, a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the Manhattan skyline, and a massive mahogany table that seated 20. I arranged printed copies of my report at each seat, connected my laptop to the presentation system, and tested the slides. Everything was in order. I was as prepared as I could be. As the minutes ticked toward 9 a.m., executives began filing in. Victor Caldwell arrived first, giving me a curt nod before taking a seat far from the presentation end of the table. Others followed, some offering polite greetings, others engrossed in their phones. Ethan Harrison entered exactly at 9, followed closely by his father. Ethan wore a charcoal gray suit with a pale blue tie that matched his eyes, exuding confidence with every step. Richard Harrison looked tired with slight shadows under his eyes, suggesting recent stress or lack of sleep. They took their seats at the head of the table, Richard at the very end, and Ethan to his right. "Good morning, everyone," Richard began. "Samantha has some concerns about our new strategic initiative that she would like to share. Samantha, the floor is yours. Please keep it concise. We have a packed schedule today." I stood smoothing my navy skirt and walked to the presentation position. "Thank you for your time this morning. I have completed a comprehensive risk assessment of the proposed investment strategy and identified several areas of concern that I believe warrant serious consideration before implementation." For the next 15 minutes, I presented my findings with clear data visualization, showing the risk factors, historical precedents, and potential consequences. Throughout my presentation, I noticed Ethan checking his phone repeatedly, barely glancing at the slides. Victor Caldwell was taking notes, but his expression suggested skepticism rather than consideration. Other executives showed varying degrees of engagement. Some appeared genuinely concerned by my findings, while others seemed uncomfortable, perhaps already sensing the political implications of my presentation. No one asked questions or made comments during my explanation. When I reached the section on currency risk, Ethan interrupted me mid-sentence. "We have already accounted for currency fluctuations in the model. This concern is redundant." His tone was dismissive, as if addressing a junior analyst who had missed an obvious point. With respect, I countered. The current hedging strategy only covers fluctuations up to 8%, but historical data for these regions shows fluctuations of up to 23% during periods of market stress. I brought up a slide showing the relevant historical data. Ethan waved his hand dismissively. Those were exceptional circumstances unlikely to repeat in the current global environment. History suggests otherwise, I persisted. Similar patterns have occurred 3 times in the past 15 years, most recently just 18 months ago. Victor Caldwell chose this moment to interject. Samantha, while we appreciate your thoroughness, I think you may be overestimating these risks. Our strategy includes multiple contingencies, not reflected in your analysis. This was patently false. I had reviewed every document related to the strategy. Could you specify which contingencies those are? They were not included in the documentation I received. An uncomfortable silence followed. Victor and Ethan exchanged glances. They're still being finalized, Ethan said finally. We have a team working on additional safeguards. I continued my presentation, moving to political risk factors, market correlation concerns, and liquidity issues. With each point, I noticed Richard Harrison becoming increasingly pensive, his brow furrowed. He had not spoken since introducing the meeting. Finally, I reached my conclusion slide, showing the probability distribution of various return scenarios based on my analysis. The chart clearly illustrated that the most likely outcomes fell far short of the projected returns, with a significant chance of substantial losses. In conclusion, I said, while the strategy's objectives are admirable, the current approach carries risks that I believe are inconsistent with Westfield's fiduciary duty to our clients. I have outlined several modifications on page 27 that could preserve the innovative aspects of the strategy while substantially reducing the risk profile. I closed my presentation and looked expectantly at the executives around the table. The silence lasted several seconds before Ethan slowly closed the binder containing my report that lay open in front of him. He leaned forward, fixing me with a cold stare. Your passion is admirable, but your conclusions are irrelevant, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. You are operating with an outdated risk assessment framework that fails to account for the new realities of global markets. Your excessive caution would keep Westfield trapped in mediocrity, while our competitors embrace innovation. I felt my face flush, but maintained my professional composure. The framework I am using is the same one that has protected Westfield from 3 major market downturns and countless poor investments. It is not about avoiding innovation. It is about innovating responsibly. Ethan's smile did not reach his eyes. Thank you for your input, Samantha. We will take it under advisement. He turned to the group. Now shall we move on to actual implementation planning? I looked to Richard Harrison, hoping the CEO would at least acknowledge the validity of my concerns or request further discussion. Instead, he simply nodded at his son and said, "Yes, let us move forward." Victor, could you outline the capital allocation timeline? Just like that, my presentation was dismissed. No questions, no debate, no consideration of the modifications I had proposed. I gathered my materials and returned to my seat, feeling a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and growing anger. For the remainder of the meeting, I sat silently as Ethan and Victor outlined implementation details for a strategy that I was now convinced would lead to disaster. When the meeting concluded, executives filed out quickly. No one made eye contact with me. As I gathered my materials, Richard Harrison briefly paused by my chair. "Samantha," he said quietly, "sometimes we need to trust the vision of those driving innovation. I hope you can get on board with this direction." Then he too was gone, leaving me alone in the boardroom. That afternoon, Diane stopped by my office and closed the door. "I heard what happened," she said. "Word travels fast around here." "It was a complete dismissal," I replied, still processing the meeting. They did not engage with a single point I raised. Ethan basically called me outdated and irrelevant, and Richard just let it happen. Diane sighed, leaning against my desk. The political reality is that Richard is grooming Ethan to take over. He is not going to publicly contradict his son, especially on Ethan's signature initiative. "So what am I supposed to do?" I asked. "Ignore serious risks because they are inconvenient to the succession plan." "I do not know," Diane admitted, "but I would be careful about your next steps. The whisper in the hallways is that Ethan views you as an obstacle now." As Diane left, I sat staring out my office window at the rainy Manhattan skyline, feeling a sense of betrayal I had never experienced in my professional life. I had always believed that at Westfield data and analysis trumped politics. Now I was facing the harsh reality that even here power and connection could override sound judgment. But something in me refused to accept this new reality without a fight. The morning after my dismissed presentation, I made my first attempt at proper escalation. I scheduled a meeting with Brandon Peters, Westfield's compliance officer. Brandon had been with the company for 15 years and had a reputation for integrity, though he rarely contradicted executive decisions. In his cramped office lined with regulatory binders, I explained my concerns and provided a copy of my risk assessment. Brandon listened attentively, occasionally jotting notes, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is concerning Samantha," he said when I finished. "Your analysis seems thorough, and these risk factors should certainly have been given more consideration." "So what can compliance do about it?" I asked hopefully. Brandon's hesitation told me everything before he spoke. Technically, no regulations have been violated yet. The strategy has been approved by the executive committee and presented to the board. While I agree that more rigorous risk assessment would be prudent, it is not strictly a compliance issue unless we can demonstrate likely violation of fiduciary duty. But is not that exactly what my report shows? I pressed. A high probability of client losses due to inadequate risk controls. It shows potential for losses, Brandon corrected carefully, but investment always carries risk. The question becomes whether the risk was adequately disclosed to clients and whether reasonable measures were taken to assess and mitigate it. He sighed. "Look, I will review this in detail and raise it with the General Counsel. That is all I can promise right now." I left feeling frustrated but not surprised. The compliance department had limited power against the combined weight of the executive team and board approval. My next step was human resources, but that proved even less fruitful. The HR director, a recent hire who owed her position to Ethan's reorganization, listened politely before explaining that this was a strategic disagreement, not an HR matter. Realizing institutional channels were unlikely to help, I reached out to Eleanor Winston, the board member who had always supported meritocracy at Westfield. We met for coffee at a small cafe, several blocks from the office, to ensure privacy. Eleanor, elegant in her tailored suit, despite being in her 60s, listened carefully to my account. "I was not at the board meeting where this strategy was presented," she admitted. "I was traveling in Europe. The materials we received certainly painted a more optimistic picture than what you are describing." "The risks were downplayed or omitted entirely," I confirmed. "The board did not receive my assessment." Eleanor frowned. "That is troubling. However, at this point, the strategy has been approved, and initial investments are probably already underway. Without concrete evidence of failure, it would be difficult to convince the board to intervene." "So, I should wait until after the damage is done?" I asked, unable to keep frustration from my voice. "I understand your position," Eleanor said gently, "but board politics are complex. Several members are close to Richard and would view this as an attack on his leadership and his son. What I can do is ask more pointed questions about risk management at the next board meeting and request detailed performance metrics as implementation proceeds." It was not the decisive action I had hoped for, but at least Eleanor was willing to maintain some oversight. As we parted, she squeezed my arm sympathetically. "Document everything, Samantha. If your concerns prove justified, that documentation will be crucial." That evening, I called Harold Jenkins, my mentor, and filled him in on the situation. Harold listened without interruption, then said, "I wish I could say I am surprised, but I have seen this pattern before. When I opposed Roger Wentworth's commercial real estate play in 2006, I was similarly sidelined. 6 months later, when the market crashed, suddenly everyone had shared my concerns all along." "What did you do?" I asked. Exactly what Eleanor suggested. I documented everything, kept my head down, and waited for reality to prove me right. It is not satisfying, but sometimes the truth needs time to emerge. Over the next few days, I discovered through informal channels that implementation of Ethan's strategy was moving even faster than announced. Victor Caldwell's finance team was quietly liquidating safer positions to free up capital for the new investments. The first transfers to Southeast Asian markets had already occurred. I began documenting everything meticulously. I saved every email related to the strategy, recorded meetings when legally permitted, and kept detailed notes of all verbal communications. I also set up private alerts for financial indicators in the target markets that would show early warning signs of the problems I had predicted. My position at Westfield was becoming increasingly isolated. Meetings I would normally have been invited to were now held without me. My team of analysts was gradually reassigned to other projects, leaving me with reduced responsibilities. Colleagues who had once sought my advice now avoided lengthy conversations, clearly not wanting to be associated with someone who had challenged the new direction. The most blatant sign of retaliation came 3 weeks after my presentation. During a department meeting, Ethan highlighted a successful risk assessment from the previous year that had saved the company millions by identifying problems in a potential acquisition target. What he failed to mention was that I had led that assessment. Instead, he credited the work to Victor's finance team, who had merely reviewed my findings. I sat silently during this revisionist history, catching Diane's sympathetic glance from across the table. After the meeting, she whispered, "That was your Adams Corporation assessment he was talking about. Everyone knows you ran that analysis." "Apparently, institutional memory is conveniently short," I replied dryly. Despite the professional isolation, I maintained my vigilance. I set up a secure cloud storage account where I backed up all my documentation, ensuring it would be accessible even if I lost access to company systems. I also began discreetly networking outside the firm, aware that my position might eventually become untenable. 6 weeks after my dismissed presentation, I overheard a conversation that confirmed my suspicions about the strategy's implementation. 2 analysts from the investment team were discussing deployment timelines in the break room, unaware of my presence around the corner. "They are moving much faster than the original schedule," one said. "Palmer told me they have already deployed 60% of the allocated capital, mostly into those tech startups in Malaysia and Vietnam." "Is not that rushing things?" the other asked. "The due diligence periods in the plan were at least twice as long. Ethan wants early wins to validate the strategy before the quarterly report. The pressure to show results is intense." This accelerated timeline increased the risk factors substantially. Shortened due diligence meant greater likelihood of missing critical problems with investment targets. I added this information to my growing documentation file. The following week, I learned about the upcoming quarterly report and shareholder meeting scheduled for August 28th, just 2 weeks away. Given the accelerated implementation, the initial results of Ethan's strategy would likely be reflected in the quarterly numbers, for better or worse. I suspected the latter. As the date approached, I updated my analysis with the latest market data from the regions in question. Political tensions had increased in 2 of the target countries. Currency volatility had risen above my projected worst-case scenario in one market. Early reports from industry contacts suggested that several of the firms Westfield had invested in were already missing their growth targets. The pieces were falling into place exactly as I had feared. The question now was whether I would be able to witness the reckoning when it came, or if I would be pushed out before then. I decided to prepare for the shareholder meeting, regardless, compiling a condensed version of my risk assessment and updated projections based on current data. Whether I would have the opportunity to present it remained to be seen, but I would be ready. The first concrete indication that my predictions were materializing came from an unexpected source. Lisa Donovan, Victor Caldwell's executive assistant, approached me in the parking garage one evening as I was leaving the office. Lisa had always been friendly with me, but had maintained professional distance given her position. "Samantha," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure we were alone. "I thought you should see these. They are the preliminary numbers for the quarterly report." She slipped a folder into my bag. "Victor has been making revisions all day, trying to present them in a better light. I have to get back before I am missed." Before I could thank her, Lisa hurried toward the elevator. That night at home, I reviewed the documents she had provided. The preliminary financial data confirmed my worst fears. The aggressive investments in emerging markets were already showing significant losses. Currency fluctuations had eroded value in 2 major positions. A political shift in Vietnam had resulted in regulatory changes that adversely affected 3 of our largest investments there. Most concerning was the section on liquidity. Several investments that were supposed to remain liquid had become effectively locked due to market conditions, meaning Westfield could not exit the positions without taking massive losses. This matched exactly the scenario I had outlined in my risk assessment. The overall impact was stark. The new strategy had contributed to a 76% decline in quarterly profits compared to the same quarter last year. And this was just the beginning. Many of the investments were still in early stages, with the potential for further deterioration. However, Victor's revisions attempted to obscure these facts. He had reorganized the reporting categories to blend the struggling new investments with more stable traditional holdings, making it harder to isolate the impact of Ethan's strategy. He had also emphasized unrealized potential and positioning for future growth rather than current performance. I compiled the raw data into a clearer format that would be more difficult to misrepresent and added it to my documentation. The evidence was mounting, and the shareholder meeting would be the moment of truth. I needed to ensure this information reached the right people before Victor's creative accounting concealed the truth. The next morning, I reconnected with Eleanor Winston, sending her a secure message requesting another meeting. We met for lunch at a restaurant far from the financial district. "This confirms everything you warned about, Eleanor," said after reviewing the numbers I had brought, "and you say Victor is attempting to obscure these results. The draft quarterly report buries these figures in misleading categories and focuses on future potential rather than current losses," I explained. "Shareholders will not get a clear picture unless someone highlights these specific outcomes." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "The board meeting before the shareholder presentation is next Monday. I will raise these concerns directly. Several other board members have been asking questions about the rapid implementation timeline. This data will give those concerns concrete foundation." "Will that be enough to change course?" I asked. "It should at minimum trigger a reassessment," Eleanor replied. "Richard may stand by his son publicly, but he is not foolish enough to ignore numbers like these once they are plainly presented. His own reputation with the board is at stake." This conversation renewed my hope that the situation could be rectified before more damage was done. Still, I continued my preparations for the shareholder meeting, creating concise visualizations of the key data points that would be difficult to misinterpret or dismiss. As the meeting approached, the atmosphere at Westfield grew increasingly tense. Ethan was rarely seen outside his office or Richard's. Victor's finance team worked late into the night, presumably finalizing the presentation materials. Even executives not directly involved with the strategy seemed on edge, perhaps sensing the brewing storm. Diane caught me in the hallway 3 days before the meeting. "I gave notice yesterday," she told me quietly. "I have accepted a position at Blackstone." The news stunned me. Diane and I had started at Westfield together, built our careers in parallel. "Why did not you tell me you were looking?" I asked. "I did not want to pressure you or compromise your position," she explained. "But with everything happening here, I need to protect my career. Stanton at Blackstone has been recruiting me for months, and the offer is excellent." I could not blame her. Diane had always been pragmatic, and the writing on the wall at Westfield was becoming increasingly clear. "I will miss you," I said sincerely. "You could come too," she suggested. "Stanton asked about you specifically. He has followed your work and has tremendous respect for your risk assessments. Say the word, and I can arrange a meeting." The offer was tempting. A clean break, a fresh start at a prestigious firm where my skills would be valued rather than undermined. Yet something held me back. "Let me get through the shareholder meeting," I told her. "I need to see this through." Diane nodded understanding. "Just do not wait too long. The offer will not be open indefinitely, and once the quarterly report goes public." She did not need to finish the thought. Once Westfield's poor performance became public knowledge, my association with the company might become a liability rather than an asset, regardless of whether I had opposed the failed strategy. The night before the shareholder meeting, I sat in my apartment reviewing my notes one final time. I had received no official communication about my role in the meeting, which suggested I would be expected to attend merely as an observer rather than a participant. This was fine with me. I had no desire to publicly embarrass the company I still cared about. My goal was not revenge, but correction of a dangerous strategy before it caused irreparable harm. I packed my portfolio with the key documents I had prepared: the clear data visualization of current losses projections for continued impact if the strategy remained unchanged, and a one-page summary of recommended modifications that could salvage the situation. Whether I would have the opportunity to share these materials remained to be seen, but as Harold had taught me years ago, proper preparation was never wasted. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with an email notification. It was from Eleanor Winston, sent from her personal account rather than her Westfield address. The message was brief: board meeting contentious, several members alarmed by data, Richard defensive but listening, Expect developments at tomorrow's meeting. Be prepared. I slept fitfully that night, my mind cycling through possible scenarios for the coming day. By morning, I had resolved to face whatever came with the same professionalism and integrity that had guided my career thus far. The truth was in the numbers, and sooner or later, numbers always told their story. The shareholder meeting was held at the Grand Meridian Hotel in downtown Manhattan, a venue chosen to accommodate the hundreds of investors, analysts, and financial media representatives who attended Westfield's quarterly bias presentations. The ballroom was transformed into a corporate theater with rows of chairs facing a stage where a podium stood before a massive screen displaying the Westfield Capital logo. I arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in my most professional charcoal gray suit. No one had contacted me about any role in the presentation, confirming my assumption that I was expected to be merely a spectator. This suited my purpose. I took a seat near the back of the room, anonymous among the gathering crowd of shareholders and investment analysts. By 10 a.m., the room was filled to capacity. The executive team filed onto the stage, led by Richard Harrison and Ethan. Richard looked composed but tired, while Ethan maintained the confident smile that had become his trademark. Victor Caldwell followed, clutching a leather portfolio, his usual calculating expression, replaced by what appeared to be genuine tension. Eleanor Winston and the other board members were seated in the front row. I noticed Eleanor scanning the crowd, perhaps looking for me, but I made no attempt to catch her eye. Better to remain inconspicuous for now. Richard stepped to the podium precisely at 10 a.m. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us for Westfield Capital's third quarter presentation. As always, we value your investment and trust in our company. His voice carried the same authoritative tone as always, betraying no hint of the troubles I knew were reflected in the numbers. He proceeded with standard opening remarks about Westfield's commitment to excellence and innovation, before transitioning to the meat of the presentation. Over the past quarter, we have begun implementing an ambitious new investment strategy led by our Executive Vice President of Strategy, my son Ethan Harrison. I would like to invite Ethan to present our strategic vision and preliminary results. Ethan took the podium with practiced ease, launching into a polished presentation about positioning Westfield for the future and capitalizing on emerging opportunities in high-growth markets. His slides showed impressive growth projections and colorful charts, illustrating potential returns, but notably lacked concrete current performance data. We are in the early stages of a transformative journey, Ethan explained, his voice confident and measured. While initial deployment has faced expected market adjustments, we are establishing positions that will yield exceptional returns as these emerging economies mature. From my seat, I could see some shareholders exchanging skeptical glances. They had come for numbers, not vague promises of future returns. Ethan seemed to sense this skepticism and quickly transitioned. For a detailed breakdown of our quarterly performance, I will now turn the presentation over to our Chief Financial Officer, Victor Caldwell. Victor approached the podium with none of Ethan's confidence. His presentation slides were dense with numbers, categories, and subcategories, exactly the kind of information overload that could obscure the most important facts. He began walking through various performance metrics, emphasizing areas where Westfield had maintained stability while glossing over the sections that showed decline. Overall, revenue remained robust at $843 million, Victor stated, displaying a chart that showed only a slight decline from the previous quarter. What he failed to highlight was that this represented a significant drop from the same quarter last year, the more relevant comparison. When he reached the profit figures, Victor employed the creative categorization I had anticipated. Operational profits in our core business segments demonstrated resilience in a challenging market environment, he said, directing attention to a chart showing relatively stable performance in traditional investment categories, while minimizing the separate section labeled Strategic Growth Initiatives, where the massive losses were concentrated. From the front row, I saw Eleanor Winston raise her hand. Victor hesitated clearly, reluctant to take questions before completing his presentation, but Richard nodded, giving permission. Mr. Caldwell, Eleanor, said, her voice clear and authoritative, your categorization seems to obscure the overall impact of our new investment strategy. Could you please provide the quarter-over-quarter and year-over-year changes in total profit for the company as a whole? A tense silence fell over the room. Victor looked to Richard, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Victor cleared his throat. when viewed in aggregate, quarterly profits show a decrease of approximately 23% compared to last quarter and 47% compared to the same quarter last year. Even these figures were understated based on the raw data I had seen. Before I could consider how to address this discrepancy, Lawrence Blackwell rose from his seat in the second row. As the representative of Meridian Partners, Westfield's largest outside investor, his presence commanded immediate attention. Mr. Caldwell Blackwell's deep voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom. My analysis of the figures provided in the pre-meeting materials suggests a much more severe decline than what you are presenting. Can you explain why my team calculates that quarterly profits have actually plummeted by approximately 80% compared to the same quarter last year when the new strategic investments are properly accounted for? The room erupted in murmurs. This was the moment of truth, the question that cut through the careful obfuscation. From my seat, I could see Ethan's confident facade crack slightly as he leaned over to whisper something to his father. Richard's expression remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. Victor fumbled with his presentation clicker. Mr. Blackwell, there are various ways to calculate comparative performance. The figure you reference does not account for non-recurring investments and positioning costs that should be amortized over the strategy's full implementation period rather than concentrated in a single quarter. That would be appropriate for capital expenditures, Blackwell countered, but not for actual trading losses, which make up the majority of this decline, according to the supplementary data. These are realized losses, not investment costs. More murmurs filled the room louder now. Financial journalists were furiously taking notes. Several analysts had pulled out calculators and were reviewing the provided materials with renewed scrutiny. Eleanor Winston spoke again. If I may add to Mr. Blackwell's point, the board's Risk Management Committee received a comprehensive assessment several weeks ago, identifying specific vulnerabilities in the new strategy, including currency exposure and liquidity concerns. That assessment predicted precisely the outcomes we are now seeing. Why was this assessment not acted upon? All eyes turned to Richard and Ethan. It was Richard who stood to respond, his voice controlled but lacking its usual confidence. The assessment in question was reviewed by the executive team and considered alongside other analytical perspectives. We determined that the concerns, while noted, were outweighed by the potential opportunities. From across the room, Eleanor's eyes finally found mine. A slight nod acknowledged my presence and the vindication of my warnings. I maintained my neutral expression even as I felt a surge of vindication. This was not about personal triumph, but institutional accountability. Another shareholder stood this one, representing a pension fund with significant Westfield holdings. Given these results, and the apparent dismissal of risk assessment warnings, what concrete steps is the leadership taking to correct course and prevent further losses? Richard began a response about ongoing evaluation and strategic adjustments, but the damage was done. The confidence in Westfield's leadership that had been carefully cultivated over decades was now visibly eroding in real time. Shareholders continued asking increasingly pointed questions, each one exposing more gaps between the presented narrative and the financial reality. Throughout this escalating crisis, I remained in my seat observing. I felt no joy in seeing the company I cared about facing such public scrutiny, but there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that truth had finally emerged. When I caught Ethan glancing in my direction, his expression a mixture of anger and realization, I allowed myself a small, subtle smile. Not of mockery, but of quiet vindication. As the questioning intensified, Richard finally held up his hand. Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that we need to address these concerns in greater detail than this format allows. I propose that we call a 30-minute recess, after which the board and executive team will present a more comprehensive response to the issues raised. With that, the executives left the stage, heading toward a side room that had been prepared for private discussions. As they filed out, Eleanor Winston broke away from the group and made her way through the crowd to where I sat. The board would like you to join us for this discussion, she said quietly. Your insight will be valuable in formulating our response. I gathered my portfolio containing the documents I had prepared and followed Eleanor toward the private meeting room. As we walked, she leaned close. You were right, Samantha. Every prediction in your risk assessment has materialized. Several board members are questioning why they were not fully briefed on these concerns before approving the strategy. The next 30 minutes would determine the future of Westfield Capital, and I was finally being given the opportunity to help shape that future. As we entered the meeting room, all eyes turned to me, including those of Richard and Ethan Harrison. The time for truth had arrived. The emergency board meeting was held in a wood-paneled conference room adjacent to the main ballroom. The atmosphere was tense, with board members and executives seated around an oval table, their expressions ranging from concern to anger. Richard Harrison sat at the head of the table with Ethan beside him, looking significantly less confident than he had on stage minutes earlier. Eleanor Winston guided me to an empty seat and announced to the room, "For those who may not know her, this is Samantha Wilson, our senior risk manager, who prepared the assessment that predicted our current situation." Richard nodded. "Thank you for joining us, Samantha. Given the circumstances, we would value your perspective on how to address the immediate concerns raised by our shareholders." I opened my portfolio and distributed copies of the documents I had prepared. I have updated my original risk assessment with current data and developed 3 potential approaches for course correction. Each approach balances the need to address the existing losses while preserving what can be salvaged from the strategy. For the next 15 minutes, I presented a clear, factual analysis of our position and outlined the options available. My recommendations included immediate exit from the most vulnerable positions, restructuring of others to provide better downside protection, and a transparent communication strategy with shareholders to rebuild trust. Throughout my presentation, Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When I concluded, he attempted one final defense. "These market developments are temporary setbacks. If we maintain our positions, they will recover as the regional economies stabilize. Exiting now would lock in losses that could be recovered with patience." I addressed his claim directly. "The data does not support that conclusion. The structural issues in these investments go beyond market fluctuations. 3 of our largest positions are in companies facing fundamental business model challenges. Additionally, the political changes in the region are not temporary disruptions, but systematic shifts in regulatory approach that will continue to adversely affect these investments." Several board members nodded in agreement with my assessment. Lawrence Blackwell, who had joined the emergency meeting as the representative of our largest investor, spoke up. "Miss Wilson's analysis aligns with our own internal review. The issues are indeed structural, not cyclical." Richard Harrison had remained largely silent, listening carefully to all perspectives. Now he straightened in his chair and made his decision. "We will implement Miss Wilson's first recommendation immediately. Victor, begin unwinding the most vulnerable positions today. We will take the losses now, rather than risk further exposure." He turned to the board members. "I take full responsibility for this situation. In our enthusiasm to drive growth, we failed to give appropriate weight to comprehensive risk assessment. This will not happen again." The meeting continued as we developed a communication strategy for the remainder of the shareholder meeting. It was decided that Richard would personally address the issues, acknowledge the errors in implementation, and outline the corrective actions being taken. The board would announce a special committee to oversee the restructuring with Eleanor Winston as chair. Before we returned to the main ballroom, Richard took me aside. "Samantha, your analysis was correct, and I should have given it the consideration it deserved. Once we navigate through this immediate crisis, I would like to discuss a new role for you, leading an expanded risk management division with direct reporting lines to the board." The offer surprised me. After weeks of isolation and dismissal, I was being offered a promotion and expanded authority. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Harrison, but I would need to understand how risk management would be integrated into decision-making going forward. The issues we face were not just analytical, but structural, in how the company evaluates and responds to risk." Richard nodded solemnly. "A fair point. I would welcome your recommendations on restructuring our risk management protocols. The events of the past quarter have made it clear that our current approach is inadequate." When we returned to the shareholder meeting, Richard delivered a forthright address, acknowledging the underperformance, accepting responsibility, and outlining the immediate corrective actions being taken. While shareholders remained concerned, the transparent approach helped stabilize the situation. The stock price, which had begun to drop as news leaked from the meeting, stabilized by the end of the day. In the weeks that followed, I faced a significant decision about my future at Westfield. Diane's offer to join her at Blackstone remained open, offering a fresh start at a prestigious firm. However, the prospect of rebuilding Westfield's risk management culture from the inside presented a unique opportunity to create lasting change. I consulted Harold Jenkins about my decision. Over dinner at his favorite steakhouse, he offered his perspective. Companies rarely get the chance to learn these lessons without destroying themselves in the process. Westfield has that chance now, and they need someone who understands both the analytical and cultural aspects of proper risk management. "You think I should stay," I concluded. Harold smiled. "I think you have a rare opportunity to transform how an entire organization thinks about risk. That does not come along often in a career." After careful consideration, I decided to accept Richard's offer, but with conditions. I would lead the new risk management division only if it included direct reporting lines to the board veto authority over investments exceeding certain risk thresholds and a seat on the executive committee. To my surprise, Richard accepted these terms without hesitation, perhaps recognizing how close the company had come to a much worse fate. Ethan Harrison was not fired, but his role was significantly altered. He was reassigned to lead a much smaller innovation team, with all his proposals subject to rigorous risk assessment and multiple levels of approval. It was a humbling change for someone who had enjoyed nearly unlimited authority, but to his credit, he accepted the new arrangement without public complaint. Over the next 6 months, I implemented a comprehensive overhaul of Westfield's risk management protocols. We established clear thresholds for different categories of risk, developed more robust stress testing procedures, and integrated risk assessment throughout the investment process, rather than treating it as a final checkpoint. Most importantly, we changed the culture. Risk management was no longer viewed as an obstacle to innovation, but as an essential partner in sustainable growth. Analysts from my team were embedded in investment groups, providing continuous risk perspective rather than after-the-fact assessment. The company's performance gradually recovered as we unwound the most problematic investments and redirected resources toward opportunities with more favorable risk profiles. By the following year's shareholder meeting, we had regained much of the lost ground and established a new reputation for balanced innovation grounded in thorough risk assessment. On a personal level, the experience transformed my understanding of corporate leadership. Technical expertise was necessary, but insufficient, without the courage to stand by your analysis when it contradicted powerful interests. I had learned that lasting change required not just identifying problems, but building the organizational structures and culture to address them systematically. As I reflect on the journey from that boardroom dismissal to my current role shaping Westfield's approach to risk, I realized that the most valuable lesson was about integrity. In a world where short-term thinking often overwhelms sound judgment, the willingness to stand firm on principles can be both professionally risky and ultimately redemptive. I still have the risk assessment binder that Ethan closed so dismissively that day. I keep it on my shelf as a reminder that sometimes being right is not enough. Creating positive change requires persistent strategy and the courage to face opposition from those with power. But when the moment of truth arrives, as it did in that shareholder meeting, the facts speak for themselves. Have you ever had to stand up for what was right in your workplace, even when it meant challenging those in authority? Share your experience in the comments below. I would love to hear how you navigated similar situations and what you learned from them. If you found value in my story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might be facing their own moments of truth in their careers. Thank you for listening, and remember that integrity may not always be rewarded immediately, but it is never wasted.